The movie is divided into 3 stories, and the first one is Rattle Rattle. In the opening scene, we see a beautiful woman named Kanako spending some quality time with her fiancé. Turns out the latter recently got divorced and is trying to start a new relationship. He soon arrives outside Kanako's house and prepares to send her off. During this, he receives several calls from his ex-wife, but he simply switches off the phone. He then surprises Kanako by gifting her a beautiful pair of pearl earrings. After greeting each other goodbye, Kanako proceeds towards home on foot. Along the way, a vase inexplicably hits her shoes. Assuming that someone dropped it from above, she looks up but doesn't see anything. Strangely, she hears rattling noises and an earring suddenly hits the ground. When Kanako checks it, she is shocked to discover that it looks exactly like hers, except that it's black in color. This makes her realize that someone is playing with her. She then looks up again, but something suddenly falls on her, knocking her out. When Kanako regains consciousness, she finds a little girl staring at her. Since it is already past minding, she asks the girl if she's lost. Just then, Kanako hears the rattling noises again, and she begins looking for the source. However, she once again doesn't find anything nearby. And when she turns around, the little girl is nowhere to be seen. Upon reaching home, Kanako treats her head wound and talks to her friend on the phone. She tells her about the mysterious incident that took place a while ago. Just then, she hears strange noises coming from the other room. But when Kanako checks, there is no one. Her phone then suddenly rings, and it is her fiancé on the other end. In a panicked tone, he reveals that his ex-wife showed up at his house, injured him, and ran away. Kanako becomes worried upon hearing this and tries to ask for more information, but the call abruptly ends. Shortly after, a scary woman in red suddenly arrives at the house, holding a knife. She slowly proceeds towards Kanako, but our heroine knocks her out with a vase instead. Regardless, the woman in red wakes up a few seconds later as if nothing happened. After this, an intense chase ensues throughout the complex. Kanako hears the rattling sounds whenever the woman is near. Terrified and worried, she runs to the streets where she soon comes across a group of people circling around a dead body. Kanako tries to grab their attention for help, but these people don't even budge. It's almost as if they're NPCs from a video game. At this intense moment, the little girl shows up out of nowhere. She points towards a broken vase that's lying by the side of the road. Seeing this, Kanako remembers a crazy woman who always looked out of her balcony. Turns out her daughter fell to her death some years ago, and the woman kept on staring at her memorial vase. In the present, when Kanako comes to her senses, she realizes that the little girl has again disappeared. The rattling noises also return, meaning that the red demon is near. Hence, she rushes inside a nearby apartment and climbs the stairs. Kanako comes across several NPCs along the way, and one of them, who has a strangulation mark on her neck, points her in a direction. Kanako rushes towards the same and hides inside a room, but she soon realizes that it's actually the red woman's house. Before she can even react, the woman arrives in her demonic form. Kanako tries to escape through the window, but she ends up falling from a great height. Following this, the movie goes into a flashback. It's revealed that the object which had knocked Kanako unconscious that night on the street was actually a woman. She landed so hard on our heroine that their bones got fused. Kanako was immediately rushed to the hospital, and the doctors performed immediate surgery to save her life. However, the mysterious woman was never identified. Kanako also went into a coma, and it is implied that all the paranormal incidents that transpired were just in her imagination. Several months later, Kanako finally recovers, and the first thing she does is visit the little girl's apartment. Turns out this is the same girl who fell from the balcony and died. A neighbor then approaches Kanako and reveals that the crazy lady who used to stare at her daughter's memorial recently took her life. Just then, the little girl and her mom suddenly show up out of thin air. Kanako notices the strangulation mark on Mom's neck, making her realize that she is the same woman from earlier. She tries to ask them what's happening, but they suddenly vanish. Then, the day changes into night and the woman in red returns. Several demonic hands grip Kanako, and one of them changes her earrings into black. She is then pushed against the railing, causing her earring to fall to the ground. At this moment, Kanako shockingly sees her other version walking on the road. This finally makes her realize that she was the one who fell on top of her other self earlier. It also means that she has been stuck in an infinite loop. The story ends as the woman in red reveals her demonic form and pushes Kanako down the apartment. The second story is titled Hagane. It begins with a teenager named Mikio who works as a mechanic. One day, his boss Tetsu asks him to go on a date with his sister, Hagane. Mikio is a bit skeptical about it, but after a lot of insistence, he agrees. The next day, when he arrives at her house, he is shocked to see Hagane using the sewing machine with a sack covering her upper body. Mikio decides to wait for her outside, thinking she will change her appearance. After a while, Hagane exits the house wearing a cute skirt and some high heels. But her upper half is still covered by the ugly sack. Mikio is definitely weirded out by the sight, but he chooses to ignore it for now. As the date progresses, Hagane starts exhibiting weird behavior. She does not utter a single word and only makes strange noises. At one point, she jumps into a river and starts floating like a log. Mikio tries to retrieve her, but she pulls him into the water using her feet. In the next scene, he takes her home and offers her fresh clothes to wear. But the weird woman kicks him to the window, injuring him. Mikio then retaliates by shoving her to his bed, but Hagane seems to like it. Using his blood and her feet, she writes the word "more." This, for some reason, excites Mikio, and he starts kissing her legs. He then approaches her private parts and asks for permission to untie her sack. Hagane agrees, but as soon as Mikio opens the sack, he sees flesh protruding out of her body. This freaks him out, and he lets out a loud scream. Unfortunately, Hagane is enraged by the reaction, and she ends up trashing his place before leaving. The following day, as Mikio is walking down the road, he is suddenly shot by tiny wooden nails. Turns out, Hagane is the one firing at him from inside the sack. Mikio tries to retaliate by beating her up with a piece of wood, but he soon gets injured by one of the spikes coming out of her sack. Hagane uses his blood to write "more" once again. She then lays on the floor and waits for him to satisfy her. However, Mikio is in no mood for that. Instead, he drops a heavy stone on her before beating her up several times with a wooden bat. That night, Mikio once again spots the weird girl. She is still limping and writhing in pain from the earlier onslaught. Soon, she collapses to the ground, and Mikio uses this opportunity to chuck her off a cliff. But the crazy woman returns unharmed and starts chasing him. Terrified, the mechanic runs into a warehouse, and Hagane follows him inside. She then opens her legs and invites him to pleasure her. This time, he agrees and dives head first inside the hole. For the first few minutes, the two have a great time as their moaning sounds fill the warehouse. But soon, Mikio starts screaming in pain, and he is soon eaten up by Hagane. After a while, her brother Tetsu arrives there and cleans up the place. Turns out this was all his plan to satisfy his sister's demands. The next day, they post a recruitment ad for a mechanic, intending to find a new victim. The final story is titled The Inheritance, and it begins in a creepy setting. A mother sings a lullaby and invites her son to come inside a shed. The little boy obliges and follows her inside, while his sister observes them from a distance. Following this, the movie fast-forwards to 30 years later. The same little girl from earlier, Saiko, returns to her childhood home with her son, Michio. She has come all the way here to take care of her elderly mother. At night, when Michio is wandering around, he spots the apparition of a young boy. He tries to get a better look, but the boy suddenly vanishes. After a while, Michio looks at some pictures in the room and notices the same boy in one of them. Upon asking, Saiko reveals that it's her brother, Masahiko. She explains that 30 years ago, he disappeared from the house, and no one knows if he's alive or dead. Michio claims that he saw him, but Saiko believes he's joking and puts him to sleep. The next day, while working in the house, Saiko hears some rattling noises coming from the shed. Believing that her son is there, she goes to check, but the place is empty. Saiko then comes across a wooden chest which contains a mysterious scroll. As soon as she reads its contents, she is traumatized. Later, when she returns to the house, Michio notices her acting strangely. Saiko, who had never smoked in her life, has now become a chain smoker. She has also changed her clothing style completely. That night, Michio prepares to go to bed, but Saiko asks him to sleep outside. After a while, he notices her venturing inside the shed, so he follows her. Michio then discovers her mother creepily combing her hair while singing a lullaby. At one point, he slips and falls off the steps, but he manages to get away without blowing his cover. The next day, a local social worker named Kajibo arrives at the house and notices strangulation marks on Michio's neck. He asks what happened, and the little boy hesitantly reveals that his mother did this to him. On the other hand, Saiko's mom calls her son-in-law and asks him to take Michio away from here before it's too late. But just then, Saiko arrives and disconnects the call. With a scary look, she claims that her son is going nowhere. After a while, Kajibo confronts her and asks if she punished her son last night. Saiko vehemently denies the accusation and instead claims that Michio is lying. She then forces him to admit that he was just fooling around with the social worker. Left with no choice, Michio does as ordered. At night, a possessed Saiko locks her son in the shed and returns to the house. She then brings out the mysterious scroll and throws it into the fire. As it burns to ashes, she screams in agony. Meanwhile, Michio wanders around the dark shed until he comes across a skull. As he holds it, he gets a vision and the movie goes into a flashback. Turns out, 30 years ago, it was his grandmother who lured Masahiko into the shed and killed him. She was actually possessed by the scroll, and it forced her to kill her own son. Now, Saiko has been possessed by the same scroll, and it means she's coming after Michio. In the present, the little boy is somehow freed by his grandmother, who asks him to run away. But Michio decides to return to the house to look for his mother. He soon finds her, and Saiko apologizes to him before hugging him. The story then cuts to a few days later, where Kajibo arrives at the house. He finds the grandmother in a critical state, babbling some words. Inside the shed, a completely possessed Saiko is holding her son's dead body, the same way her mother had once held Masahiko's body.